Hi there. In today's episode, I talked with a British political scientist who has more than 30 years of experience studying Slovakia and has now made it her home. She's also the author of the book Slovakia, An Escape from Invisibility. But we didn't talk about war or politics or international relations. We discussed her unique perspectives on life and people of Slovakia. I hope you enjoy our conversation. And if you do, please don't hesitate to like and share and subscribe. Thank you. Karen, thank you so much for joining me today. It's so lovely to see you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
So Karen, do you remember the first time we met is about 2009 spring? Wow, it's a long time back.
It's a long time ago. And I don't think we ever believed then that
we would end up
13, 14 years on, we'd both still be
in
living
Slovakia.
here. Yes,
amazing. Tell us about your journey from there, or about yourself, and what brought you to Slovakia.
It was really a matter of chance in part. I initially studied Russian and German and politics at university, but I went to the Soviet Union as a student, and somehow I never quite felt at home with the culture. It was a very large country and it was very closed,
right.
Whereas there were other countries in this region which, although they were under Soviet-style communism, somehow it was much easier to have normal relations with people who lived there. They were much more accessible, and although I initially went to Poland and Hungary a lot, I was told that Czechoslovakia would be a really interesting country to visit. Although the communist system was very strict here, actually the quality of the intellectual life was very high. Yeah. And so I applied to go and research for a year in Prague, and then got a letter saying, congratulations, you've been given a place at the Comenius University in Slovakia. So I said, but I don't speak Slovak, I've learnt Czech. And of course in Prague they just said, well, that doesn't matter, the Slovaks will understand Czech. But of course I didn't speak Czech.
Right.
I could read Czech, and I assumed after a week there, the speaking it would come.
Right.
But I kind of knew I couldn't improve my Czech in Slovakia, so I started to learn Slovak. And actually it did go very quickly because I was here, not many people spoke English. I was reading a lot in Slovak during the day, I was hearing everywhere. And I did, in the end, I spoke Russian and I'd learnt Czech. So
it was not that far. I've heard that Russian, Czech, Slovak, they're all from the Slavic family. So it's if you understand and speaks Russian, is that true that Slovak is relatively easy?
It's a lot easier. I mean, my problem was that for many years I talked what my friends jokingly called Czechoslovak. Czechs thought I was speaking Slovak and Slovaks thought I was speaking Czech. Was actually,
right.
I was trying to speak the language that matched whichever part of the country I was in. But now I don't think the Czech's that noticeable in my Slovak anymore because I've spent so much more time here.
Yeah. So Karen, looks like Slovakia was a lovely accident. You had initially planned and opted to move to Prague, but you ended up in Bratislava, and personally it worked great for me because we get to know each other. We got to know each other. So you are a lecturer in university, Karen. Let's talk about the student life of you as a student. You have a probably experience also being a student in Slovakia back then, plus also how you see as an educator students then and now. I just want to understand what is your...
the first thing, of course, I have to say is that sometimes as a university lecturer you wonder if you do understand students. But I mean, there are certain trends you see, and there are differences in the way British students and Slovak students structure their lives now. But at the same time, I'm very conscious that students in Britain now are very different from what they were like in the 1970s when I was at university. So there are differences between countries. There are also differences between generations, how they experience life and how they structure their life strategies to cope with the modern world as it is at that point.
And so when I know that your time as a research student was, you were already like out of the school
Yes,
and university.
I was
you
older
already,
then, yes.
a grown adult. And tell us about your experience of Slovakia back in '87, although it was brief. Could you?
It was, in terms of the attitudes to communism, it was very interesting, because if you came here or to the Czech lands in the late communist period, you kind of knew that this system couldn't last much longer, because everybody thought it was a kind of very sick joke. And compared to being, say, in the Soviet Union, it was very noticeable here that everyone criticized the system and that everyone had coping mechanisms of how you dealt with the system, whilst also building your own life, looking after your family, and doing things that were important to you.
So when you say everyone, you mean the people of Czechoslovakia, then not the students, foreigner students who came to Czechoslovakia?
No, the people who lived here. There were very, very few research students from Western Europe in that period. The students who came tended to be from countries where the university systems had problems, and it was they would get a better university education in Slovakia than they would at home. Western students, it tended to be people who had a particular interest in this region, so we, I guess, had slightly different agendas from most students when we got here.
Wow, so it's fascinating to hear about your journey. So I think, fast forward a couple of years later, I think around when the communists ended or started to fall, that's probably a milestone in your life where you kind of moved more permanently, or rather with a long-term plan to Slovakia, or probably still Czechoslovakia.
Well, I mean, I was very, very lucky, because I was just about ready to get a university job in 1989, and because of the collapse of communism, suddenly people were really interested in all these funny little countries like Czechoslovakia and Hungary and Poland, which were suddenly becoming independent actors. And this made me very employable at a university, because in the past they'd had all these Soviet experts, and kind of Eastern Europe was regarded as a subfield of the Soviet Union. And then suddenly they had to cope with the fact that these countries were all going in different directions, and within a few years that some of them were going to be credible candidates for joining the EU. So the whole EU studies field became interested in this region. And for someone like me who'd been studying it for years, it meant I had a skill set that was at last marketable. It was very fortunate for me.
It was like a career break making opportunity for you.
It was good timing. I mean, in the 1980s, the academic market, the university market, was very, very badly hit in Britain. Margaret Thatcher cut back on the universities, and cut back in particular on Russian studies, so it was absolutely impossible to get a job, and I worked at the BBC for several years. Then I decided, okay, this region and politics is what really interests me. I'll go back and study it and see what happens. And then the Iron Curtain fell down. It was perfect timing for me. I was very lucky.
Great. So, Karen, I remember during one of our walks, and we were hiking, and we, like I said, I had just moved from India to Slovakia. My knowledge of Slovakia and Czechoslovakia and all about the Eastern Bloc was very limited, because in our education system, I don't think, at least when I was a student, we did not study this aspect or this part of history in so much detail. So it was all learning through, Google. I think that's how I find when my employer told me we're sending you to Bratislava, and it was a beautiful little city, and I was excited. But I was still very fascinated to learn more about the history and the whole, communist times. You mentioned a very interesting term, if you remember, that Slovakia, I think, will have to deal or is dealing with communist hangover.
Yeah.
Tell us more. And I think when you came, it was just the time that communist ended. Was the hangover already had the hangover started then, or
it was always noted. I mean, I was here as a research student in '87, so this was when communism was visibly in trouble. There were religious petitions for religious freedom being passed around in villages, which aren't normally kind of rebellious types of environments. There was the candle demonstration in Bratislava in, when would that have been, spring 1988. Things were happening that showed things were moving. Then there was the collapse of communism, which was very, very rapid here, and adaptation on all sorts of different levels. Sometimes it was, retrospectively, it's easy to attribute everything to communist hangovers, and then you realize actually it's not a communist hangover. It's a hangover from the very strange adaptation processes people had to make during the transition from a state-owned to a market economy, the transition to EU membership, and change was going on at all sorts of levels.
There was always, for me, it was confusing to see whether people are missing communism's way of living. Is it just a male perception versus a female? Do you know what I mean?
Sometimes women think that the same. I mean, obviously, the change from communism hit different environments and different generations differently. I mean, I can remember when I first came here, I was about the only single woman. I was in my 30s. I was about the only single woman around. Women always got married here because single women had no chance under communism. Yeah. They were sort of permanently infantilized. They had to live with their parents. It was very, very difficult for them to get a flat on their own. You had to get married and have children to get a flat. They didn't really have many opportunities. Then when communism collapsed, there was a lot of complaints about childcare being more expensive, or facilities for children getting worse, and particularly in Western Europe, people used to complain about that because it was very, very difficult for women to work and have children in the West at the time. So they'd been rather fond of the cheap nurseries and childcare in the communist countries. They thought it must be a good thing, and it was collapsing. I noticed something completely different under post-communism. I didn't notice that things were getting worse for women with children. I noticed that things were getting radically better for single women. The women who had hit 24 or 25 and weren't married yet and didn't have children, they suddenly had a huge range of opportunities. They could travel. They could take all these nice research scholarships abroad. If they were interested in English, they could get a nice scholarship somewhere. They could travel as an interpreter or translator. All sorts of opportunities, and then if they worked abroad at all and earned a lot of money, they could actually buy themselves a flat. They could buy themselves nice things. These were opportunities that had never existed in the past. So I had a slightly different perspective on post-communism being bad for women. Also, of course, the number of abortions went down because contraception improved, and women started having children later. Because women used to have children very young here, well, for two reasons. Firstly, it was helpful for getting a flat if you had children. But secondly, in Western Europe, people delayed having children because they needed the double income in order to get onto that housing ladder to buy a flat, whereas here having the children first was a better strategic decision to make.
So I'm glad you mentioned your opinion of, or your observation on single women, because when I came to Slovakia, I came as a single woman. You came as a single woman, and we, for me, I was very, and I think I'm talking about a couple or almost a decade after communist fell, and yet I felt, and I had a lot of inhibitions of, about my decision to come and live here without a family, without a support system. Did you feel anything negative, or even, or what was your observation, and did you adopt it well, settle well, or did you have any kind of hindrances?
As a single woman, what was fantastic for me here, as a research student, university lecturer in their 30s, was being surrounded by other women. I mean, when I first got a job in a British university, I was the only female lecturer in the department. I was in an environment where women were secretaries, they were students, they were cleaners, but they weren't lecturers. And so that was a very isolating environment. So coming here, sure, all the women were married and had children, but there were women lecturers, there were women professors. I'd never met actually I had met a woman professor in Britain, but they were still something really unusual. So from that point,
the choice of profession was also something that radically changed post-communism for the women.
Well, not really. It changed in some senses. The life of women here has changed less in the last 30 or 40 years, let's say 40 years, than it has in Britain, because women always had careers and children here, whereas that's a relatively recent development in Western Europe. But I mean, I think in terms of generations, there's a huge difference, because in Britain nowadays, the younger generation complain the whole time. They're convinced they're very hard done by. They complain that we don't get grants to go to university, we have to have loans, we have to pay fees for our university, you got your studies free. And then I point out, and only 8% of people were allowed to study. It's 40% now. That's why someone has to pay. Also, young people in Britain complain that their parents were able to afford to buy a house or a flat. We can't afford to buy a house or a flat. We can't even rent a flat. We have to live with our parents. They complain that when they retire, they'll get much lower pensions than we got. They forget that some things have got a lot better over the years. They're convinced things are worse for them. And here, although sometimes I think the younger generation don't appreciate the advantages they have compared to their parents' and grandparents' generation, you don't get the same complaining here that we're not going to get the chances our parents had. Very few young people here believe that their parents also, or certainly don't believe their grandparents had better opportunities than they did. They understand that that under communism things were very, very restricted. They may forget about, or not really understand some things about communism now, but they do know there's been a...
So your students now, Karen, in Slovakia, Slovak students, who probably have not got a first-hand experience of communist times, how do you see them in terms of their general belief, their general way of thinking, their perception and their expectations of the society or the world at the moment?
It's quite difficult to say, because I live in Bratislava, and there are differences between life in Bratislava and in the rest of Slovakia. For students, their life chances do depend to a certain extent on the sort of family background they have, what financial support the parents can give them, and things like that. Generally, students tend to multitask much more here than they would do in Britain. One of the problems we had when I was still teaching in Britain was we'd have students from this region would come over, perhaps they had a scholarship, and would do a master's degree for a year. And sometime about April, we discovered that they were still doing a full-time degree at their home university, and they were having trouble managing the workload. And we just sat there and said, yeah, if you try and do 2 university degrees at the same time, of course you have a problem with the workload. But in this society, people who are very clever and very hardworking often manage to do
Multiple
2 things
jobs
at the same time and maybe something else. It's an effective life strategy which doesn't work as well in Western Europe. A lot of students work here and they do much more interesting jobs than they would do in Britain. British students in Britain do very, very routine manual jobs, you know, waitressing, factory work, this sort of thing. A lot of the students here have quite good jobs in foreign companies where they earn quite well and get a lot of useful work experience. There's a tendency in Britain for students who do really interesting jobs for work experience actually work for free as an intern, so-called, which isn't very fair, but you know, if you can afford to work for nothing, you can get some good experience for your curriculum vitae.
So, do you teach in Slovak? What is your medium of communication?
I teach sometimes in English and sometimes in Slovak.
So you're fluent in Slovak?
Pretty fluent, yes. Though I have a problem with Slovak. When you teach yourself a language, and I've noticed this actually with Slovak students in Britain as well, when you teach yourself, you can read, you can understand, and you can speak. It's much harder to write. You really need a teacher to learn how to write a foreign language. And I have that problem in Slovak. Plus, I'm very rarely required to write in Slovak.
That's true.
Both because people want me to write my articles in English, and because if something has to be published in Slovak, there are loads of people around me who'll happily translate it into Slovak for me. So the demand is for me to write in English, and for that reason, although I've lived here a long time, I very rarely have to write anything in Slovak. Or if I do, it's an email and I leave off all the čarky and the hačky and, you know, these accents, because you can get away with that in an email. And then if I have to write properly, I put my word into Slovak, so it'll underline things. And I have to think, well, is there a line on that vowel, or is it, no,
So there is an aspect of Slovakia which is so fascinating, you know, that comes from the way people live their life, you know, the habits like hiking and the nature. Do you agree with me? Do you have
yes,
your
I mean,
opinion?
I think the quality of life in Bratislava is very high. I mean, I always say a capital with about 500,000 people is perfect, because it's a capital city, so something is happening here, but it's small enough that you find out about it. It hasn't got the anonymity of a lot of big cities, whereas it's got the life of a capital city and the opportunities of a capital city. Then it's got this very nice location near several other countries, and we have this nice international airport in Švehat that's very near. And yet I live very near the main railway station. Nonetheless, within an hour, I am already on a major hiking trail in a national park. You know, an hour on foot, and I'm already in the national park from the centre of a capital city.
That was our first hike. I remember it was, we literally started from the train station. And in a few minutes, we were climbing up.
You're in the vineyard.
Hill, we were in the vineyard. Yes, absolutely.
And you know, that's very good. People with children say that facilities for children are still radically cheaper here than in West European countries, that it's not such a drain on the finance to have children here, particularly things like summer camps during the school vacation. There's a lot more opportunities in that respect here. But again, if you've a reasonable income, you can have a very good quality of life here. And having multiple incomes, several jobs, is much more tolerated here than it would be in Western Europe. If you really have no one in your family who can help you out and you hit bad times, then the social safety net is not good here. For people, pensioners who have the minimum pension,
that probably is not the best as compared to the rest of
Europe. There are real issues then.
Also about so I often, when we have discussions with other mothers, I agree, like you said, we, this country, or probably Bratislava, since I live here mostly, is very child friendly, it's very family friendly, but also I feel that a lot of people who are not living in Bratislava, the other part of Slovakia, do you see that the development has not grown to that the other big cities, or that requires more time?
I don't know. I mean, I still think people underestimate the public transport system here. I mean, I lived in Slovakia for several years. I knew it quite well before I understood that I didn't have to plan around hikes and drive to the beginning of the hike, that I could actually get a bus somewhere and end up wherever I wanted to end up, and then I just had to get out my mobile phone and find where the nearest bus home was. You couldn't do that in the countryside in Britain or in Ireland. The public transport service is not good enough. And I think also, if you live in a rural area here, people complain that the bus service has got much worse, but it's still cheaper to move around than it is in many other countries. Trains are still relatively cheap, and of course if you're over 62 they're free. So I think in some respects rural life is not so problematic here. The rural infrastructure in Slovakia from the communist period was actually very good in terms of road networks. So maybe not motorways, but
So Karen, you are an avid hiker. Tell me about your favorite places in Slovakia, where you would go. What's your go-to place, favorite view?
Well, I like the Malafatra as a sort of mountain range most. Where I think Slovakia is the world leader is in waymarked hiking paths. That wonderful system of the white, red, white, green, white, those hiking trails. I think my favorite Slovaks are the people with the paint pots who paint the trees for me so I don't get lost, and those wonderful little poles with the yellow poles with the red hat on, telling you how far. It'll tell you how long you'll get to the next place.
You don't have these in the other countries, or in
very little. The Austrian system was always relatively good, and the last few years they've now got several colours in there. It's still nowhere as good as Slovakia. Nowhere's quite as good as Slovakia. Everywhere else has improved a bit, but I have this app on my phone now, and it shows me all the hiking paths and where I am and the timings of how long that piece of path would take. And plus the fact that there's a lot of mountains and hills that are, they're high enough to be interesting, but they're not so high that they're mountaineering jobs and they're difficult. So, I keep on pressing people that, Slovakia is a wonderful hiking country to go to.
I think it's perfect time for us to, head out go out
Yes.
and have some kofola and some fried
Yes.
cheese, and then we'll walk a little bit into the town. What do you say?
Yep, that's
Yeah?
fine.
Thank you
We'll
so
do
much,
that.
Karen. It was lovely
And
talking
thank
to
you.
you.
It was nice talking to you.